What's the worst, I hate to break it to you, moment you had with someone?
I had a guy working for me that was extremely nice, easy to get along with, and wildly inept. Not even like low effort, but just not capable of learning seemingly basic tasks. We tried everything. Coaching, giving him legitimate checklist instructions, having a team lead sit with him for a couple weeks to walk him through basics, everything. Everyone said the same thing. He just couldn't do the job. Everything he did had to be double-checked by somebody else, which meant that we might as well have somebody else do it. But everyone liked the guy, they thought he was easygoing and cool to be around, everything. But still he just straight up couldn't do that job. So I had to find another place for him in the company that would better match his skills. The option would be for him to either take the lower job with lower pay, or he would be fired, with severance. I was not looking forward to the conversation. I called him in for a one-to-one to break it to him, and the first thing he started with was, "Hey boss, before we start I just want to tell you that I really feel like I've been doing a great job here and I would like to talk about a raise." Yeah, that conversation was not a fun one.
I had a similar instance in my career where the person legitimately was working harder than anyone else to try and learn and contribute. Everyone saw her as the first to show up, the first to volunteer, attending conferences on weekends to improve skills, and basically working on improvement constantly. As the one reviewing her work and attempting to give her additional training constantly, it became a huge burden on me trying to get her to some level of competency and failing to even get her to complete basic tasks without coaching constantly. I had to break it to her that we couldn't keep her on the team. She cried a lot about how she was working harder than everyone else and she didn't understand why this was happening. She got angry when I tried to give her some parting constructive criticism that she was asking for, and stormed off screaming that the group couldn't function without her and that we were going to realize all she really did after she was gone. It was so hard thinking of how much easier it would be with her gone. She really was a hard worker, really was dedicated, really gave it more effort than anyone else. She just wasn't capable of doing the job.
I had to tell my friend that the online girlfriend he'd been talking to for months was actually a scammer using stolen photos. He was planning to send her money to come visit, and breaking the news to him was one of the toughest conversations I've ever had.
Oof. I had this one with an old friend that I lived with at the time. He'd been getting obviously catfished for years, thankfully not monetarily, just a lonely girl looking for attention, over the phone and internet, but just refused to believe the signs. It was weird for many reasons, one being that this dude was attractive, fit, and fun to be around, and shouldn't have had issues meeting women. Also we were young, like 20, 21. Plenty of time ahead of him. Once we broke him out of it, he did just fine. It took me pushing him to buy plane tickets to meet her, though, because it had gotten to the point where the only way he'd believe she wasn't who she said she was is if he saw for himself. She thankfully came clean during the trip planning stage, so no loss on the tickets.
I used to work in a customer care call center for a major telecommunications company. A woman called in one day to inquire about two $99 charges on her bill from Lava Life. She kept pressing about the charges, what they were, and I had to explain to her that Lava Life is a dating service and that the charges were legitimate. If she didn't make them, did someone else live in her house who might have? There was only her husband, and I heard her go from, "But he would never," to, "I have to go now," as it set in. That was almost 20 years ago now and I still feel awful about it.
I work at a bank and recently one of my coworkers was helping a member trying to figure out what a charge was. It was for a salon, which neither her or her husband went to, coming from his card on a day when he was supposed to be on a business trip. Edit, definitely wasn't stolen. Our system will tell us if a transaction happened online/POS/etc. It was with a card, at the city local salon, and the husband still had the card.
There was a rule at my job where only one of these two supervisors could be off at a time. One of them loved to take a full week off work during holidays, to get more bang for his PTO buck. One year, He had Thanksgiving week off, but the other supervisor had family come to town that week on late notice. The other supervisor asked him to cancel just one of his days so she could spend the day with family. He declined, even after she basically begged him, and he even said he didn't have anything to do that day. She then proceeded to take PTO days every Wednesday of a holiday week for the next calendar year, effectively blocking him from taking his cheap weeks off. He told me that he thought it was funny because he knew she didn't have enough time to take all those vacation days off, and she'd eventually have to cancel some of them. I got to tell him, I hate to break it to you, but she only took 2 hours off each of those days. See, the rule didn't differentiate between a partial or whole day, so she only had to burn 24 or so hours to block him. He looked devastated. It was kind of petty on both of their parts, but I give her credit for being creative in her retribution and don't blame her a bit for what she did.
My best friend in high school was overweight and would sweat profusely. We would come in after lunch in Texas and he would smell awful. I think he would wear his clothes without washing them after sweating. We had English after and the AC sucked, so, teacher put a fan in the window. He would sit in front of the fan and blow his funk over everyone. The class got together and voted that I should be the one to tell him. Well, I had to break it to him that for the last year he has smelled horribly. I felt pretty bad, but he never stunk again.
Not me, but I went to visit my dad at his job and he has an employee there who was kind of bragging to his other co-workers about how well he has been doing at the job and thinking of asking for promotion. My dad later told me that he fired that guy later that day due to poor performance, despite multiple attempts to help him. LOL.
I had an upper management type guy try to explain to me, in a very condescending way, how a specific device works and how to install it. All completely wrong. I wrote the manual for it, I own the patent, it's named after me.
The company I was at called in a consultant, Peter, to help with a bit of data migration. We're in a meeting and the guy is laying out a pretty easy to follow timeline that sounds like it'll take about a week. Longer than we thought, but totally doable. The boss didn't like that and started pestering Peter with what ifs. What if we didn't use a staging machine and dumped it all at once? What if we physically migrated the data via tape instead of using the network, etc. After the third or fourth, that won't work because. Peter asks the boss if he knows who wrote the software in the first place. Boss, PalSoft, why? Peter, and do you know why they were called PalSoft? Boss, no. Enlighten me, smart guy. Peter, because my initials are PAL and I started the company. The boss didn't have any more questions or suggestions. Came to find out later that we wrangled Peter because of a personal relationship he had with someone in the C-suite.
I came back from my first day of finals in my first semester of college to find 2 women in suits and a campus police officer waiting for me. The women were mental health counselors from the university. One of them tried to talk to me but started crying, the other one couldn't say anything either. It was finally the cop who told me that someone had broken into my mother's house that morning and murdered her, my mom.
Oof, definitely the time I had to tell a friend that the business opportunity he was so excited about was actually a pyramid scheme. He was so hyped, talking about how he was going to quit his job and be his own boss. I tried to ease into it, but there's really no soft way to say, hey man, you're about to lose a lot of money and ruin your friendships.
I had a roommate who had lunch with an old college buddy one time who told him about this great business venture he could join, and gave him a lot of the details of it, including some paperwork. His friend told him several times, it's not an MLM. It was for Amway. You know, one of the earliest MLMs.
My sister-in-law. My niece plays field hockey and I love her. She plays in 2 different leagues. Meaning it's 3 hours of field hockey games every Saturday and Sunday. My SIL expected me and my husband to drive an hour one way both days to watch niece play and pay rapt attention the whole time. Did I mention the games are at 7 a.m.? We did this about once a month on either Saturday or Sunday, and I guess this wasn't enough for her. We had to tell her that we loved niece, but we weren't going to be as involved as she was in the league.
When I got the call that my mom had passed, they wouldn't say that she had passed, or that she had died. They kept saying medical things like, she doesn't have a pulse, she is not breathing, etc. It took a long time to understand that they were saying she was gone, and that it was final.
In my job, I occasionally have to break the news to people their relative has died, and in normally sudden and unexpected circumstances. We are taught to specifically tell them they're dead or something similar, and not that they passed or are in a better place, to avoid exactly what happened to you. It's harder being blunt, but in the end it's much better.
Had a friend ask me about some green sign in the distance. It was in fact a sodium vapor sign giving off an intense orange light, which sodium vapor is known for. Had to tell him right there that he was colorblind. He was in his mid-30s too. A lot of odd things that had happened in his past fell into place for him that day.
Had a colleague who was profoundly colorblind, and a boss who liked to run him about it endlessly. On said boss's last day, he asked my colleague how he found out he was colorblind. My colleague explained the tests and pointed him at some online versions. My boss says, "Hey, you/overkill, this test site is broken." I go and check and it's working fine. Turns out my boss was also profoundly colorblind, even more so than my colleague, just in a different set of colors. He'd never known, but it did explain his wildly clashing wardrobe.
15 years ago, my friend's father sadly passed away shortly after we graduated college. It was devastating for him. He figured he'd at least get a nice money boost to help him get back on his feet, but unfortunately, his father kept it a secret that he was deep in debt and had no liquid cash to his name. My friend had no support, and fell into a terrible depression. He was broke, he couch crashed with me and our friends for a while, he quit his job. And he got comfortable with this new lifestyle. 2 years later, he's still spending a month here and there with various friends around the city, eating their food, occupying their couch, sipping off their booze cabinet, using the terrible tragic passing of his father as his reasoning for being the way he was. It had been 2 years, we understood the pain he felt was real, but it was really time for him to actually get back on his feet and taking care of himself. We didn't know how to explain it to him, but we all felt he was taking advantage of us, and was using his father's death as an excuse to just not get a job. I found him a job. A nice one. One he would be good at, he went to school for, and didn't need prior work experience. I talked to a team lead and an HR rep, and got him a contact line for them, basically assuring an interview and a job offer if he arrived on time and sober. Weeks later, my HR rep and this team lead were confused, thinking I didn't relay the information to him. He never called. I gave him a layup of a job opportunity and he just ignored it outright. I called him out on it, but he told me to calm down and chill out, and that I wasn't being sensitive to his depression, and I wasn't understanding of his needs. So my worst, I hate to break it to you, moment, wasn't actually with him. It was with all my friends afterward. I had to tell them all to turn him down every time he asked to stay a week at their place. It sucked. The timing and my response to his refusal would give it away. This guy knew I was the horrible jerk who turned all his friends against him and denied him free room and board. Hell, I was probably going to be the sole reason he'd blame for his inevitable descent into homelessness. I accepted the burden, and called them up, explaining I had a job lined up for him and he refused, and we must all stop giving him a free place to stay if he won't take an easy job. Yes, it sucks his dad died. And it sucks he didn't get any kind of inheritance to start his life proper. It sucks he felt this terrible depression that lingered for years, and most of all, it sucks he had a group of enabling friends like me who humored it for so long it just became his accepted norm. We failed him. He didn't end up homeless, though. Without us offering his jobless but a couch to crash on anymore, he ended up moving in with his aunt. Apparently she didn't take his excuses, didn't put up with his laziness, and did all the things we should have been doing all along. No booze allowed. No weed. No gaming after she went to bed. She only had one TV in the house and it was for Food Network only. He got a job developing 3D assets for VR titles, and started moving up and up creating VR experiences for architecture companies. Dude still hates me probably, and I'll admit I made mistakes to justify it. But I'm really grateful his aunt was there. I did what I needed to do, but it would have been even 10 times worse if he did end up living on the streets, still blaming his father's sudden death for his 2-decade-long predicament.
Freshman year of college, a friend said that he was going to go barefoot as much as possible to toughen up his feet so that his future kids would be born with tough feet too. Had to explain to him why that wouldn't work and the basics of genetics. He didn't believe me and stuck with his theory. We have since lost touch, but I know he had a son a few years ago. I'll have to ask him if it worked out.
Having to tell a student who was almost totally blind that she likely couldn't be an ER nurse. She and her dad moved to our district, and at the IEP, her dad starts talking about how he can't wait for Sue to go to nursing school. I frantically scanned my brain, trying to think of how someone who was going to need Braille would be able to do that job. Then Sue piped up to say that her dream was to be an ER nurse. Her prior district told her she could do anything, including this. She had a degenerative disease that would eventually make her blind. I talked to my friends who were nurses, I talked to our career lady at the school, I researched, but there just wasn't any way someone who couldn't see could be an ER nurse. I reconvened the IEP and had to explain this. I know both were in denial, but I was not happy that the prior district pumped up this idea. I mean, sure, there is lots she could still do, but that just wasn't one of them. Then another student came from the same district with the idea she could be a CSI investigator. She was also nearly blind.
Not me, but my ex. A couple years ago got a job as a cook working at a big hospital. They had a mostly set and reoccurring cycle of dishes/items in Golden Corral style stations around the cafeteria. Basic beach food dressed up or pre-prepped. Nothing too fancy. His first month he became familiar with some of the residents/doctors who would make small talk and shoot the shit with him as he loaded up their plates. One of these doctors was a man originally from India who was very enthusiastic about the country fried chicken smothered in pepper gravy. He said it was his favorite dish out of anything else there, and it wasn't uncommon for him to stop by at the end of his shift to purchase extra to take home. My partner's first time working the entree station, the doctor pointed and asked my partner for his usual country fried chicken. My partner stared at him confused. They didn't serve country fried chicken. But they do have chicken fried steak. When he nonchalantly informed the doctor of this, the man's eyes went wide, he looked genuinely shocked. This isn't chicken. My partner described the expression on his face as going from Jared and baffled to so sad when he realized he had been eating beef this entire time. But also that it had tasted so delicious. Apparently, despite eating other types of meat, the man was still deeply tied to his Hindu roots and avoided beef in his regular diet because of this. The previous cook before him had mistaken these ambiguous meat patties smothered in thick gravy for chicken, so wires got crossed and he then relayed that incorrect information to the doctor. I still cringe when I think about this. X felt so sad he had to be the one to tell him.
My ex-wife tried to commit suicide twice in 1 week. The second time, she was committed to a psych ward. Her mother decided to come over and help with the kids and household chores. The second day she is at the house, she comes out of the bedroom disoriented. Turns out she is having a stroke. For the third time that week, I had to call 911. I had to go to the psych ward and tell my suicidal, drugged-up wife that her mother, who she was very close to, was in the hospital because she had a stroke.
My story is different, but maybe just as awful. I was under 20 myself and had to break it to my slightly older sister who had recently woken from a coma that both of our parents had passed away in the accident she was in. I still count that as the worst moment of my life. Even worse than when my younger sister told me what had happened.
I had an employee who was a strict vegetarian for religious reasons. One day, we were discussing the employee salad bar and he mentioned how much he loved the Caesar dressing packets they offered. I was surprised and stupidly blurted out, "Oh, I didn't realize you ate fish." He responded that he was vegetarian and gave me a quizzical look. I had to explain that the salad dressing contained both fish and Parmesan cheese, which is almost always cultured with animal rennet. He didn't believe me and, the next day, insisted on reading the ingredients on one of the packets to me to prove to me that I was wrong. Then he got to the anchovies and got quiet. I still feel awful that he had to find out that way. Neither of us handled the situation well.
A friend of mine unironically thought that he was the first person ever to experience existentialism. He literally said that no one ever talks about how small we are in the grand scope of the universe and kept saying that no one else ever wants to talk about the meaning of life. I felt too bad to explain to him that the concept of how small we are in relation to our world has literally been one of the backbones of philosophy for centuries.